Hello, this is Hit Pause, a podcast made in San Francisco with more questions than answers. Of our little podcast, I'm going to rebound on the last episode where we looked at the comparison of today's medium of mass communication at an age of social media and a nuclear reactor, and the necessity to have means and ways to slow down messages instead of accelerating them. We looked at time, the importance of time, the importance of taking time in absorbing technology changes, and what happened during the crisis and the accident at Chernobyl as a way to make us think, to put things in perspective. In this episode, maybe we're going to dive a little deeper into the complexities and the risks that not doing so can spell for the economy, for society. When I've been a student of history, a student of the media and the technology world, over time I started observing, thinking that maybe there is a law of the trifecta effect of three major changes on the human mind, on the human psyche. We'll study and look at and talk about the human psyche and how we are made as human beings, part conscious, part subconscious. We'll look at that during the season 2 of this podcast. But for now, I'm focusing on the economy. I'm focusing on what we're living all together in this pandemic and this economic crisis, which are now together tied. And I wonder if there's a trifecta or maybe a rule of economic changes that brings together certain periods in time for very special imbalances, just like the imbalance of a nuclear reaction or a nuclear reactor gone awry. Surely we went through periods of war in the world history, the Middle Ages, the so-called Guerre de Cent Ans, the 100 years war between France and England, during the middle of the last century, and surely there will always be, within a period of relative technology stability, skirmishes, wars, and localized conflict. But what gives me pause is to think about what happens when the world finds itself at a conjunction of three factors and trends that combine together create the conditions of imbalances which create precisely the moment of destabilization of the entire system, like we saw at Chernobyl, a cascade of chain reaction that goes unchecked. Here's my theory, my thought, my observations, and my predicate maybe. At a time when there is a conflation of a economic change in the fabric of the economy, spelled by technology transition, combined with a equivalent change in the medium or the containers that society uses. We looked in episode 5 at the concept of container in media. It becomes possible to have a spark, an event, an incident, which is triggered by what I would call the emotional sphere, that then produces the conditions of a catastrophic reset, an explosion, and yes, a war. Let me take a couple of examples. When we look at World War I, I came to be taught during my school years that simply the war had been created by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in the Balkans. Nothing could be more wrong. When you really look at the evolution of the mentalities, the complex evolution of the economy, we were then, in years and decades before, marching as a society towards the absorption of a new set of technologies brought by the rapid industrialization of the steam engine, the train, the telegraph, which all were advancing at a rapid pace of evolution. We were at the time witnessing the transformation of an economic sphere of agricultural farmers tilling their soil with a horse and their heavy tools in the farm, immortalized by the classic paintings of Monet and Manet that we all have in mind, with this French countryside, the hard labor of manual workers, who little by little were replaced in terms of economic creation by a novel new fringe of society, who were the industrial workers of the mills. And that economic transition took, of course, years. To look into the French literature was documented by Zola, who wrote better than anybody else about that slow migration of people from the farm to the cities, the rapid growth of the cities, the rapid growth of the city of Paris, the arrival of poverty in those urban centers. And that story, by the way, has repeated itself time and time again, and at the time was also the story of the transformation of the United Kingdom, Great Britain at the time, England, and is now also seen into the more developing countries with hyper-urbanization in Africa or Southeast Asia. Those displacements are basically changing the way that people think about their livelihood, find job, bring value to their sense of rapport to time, to nature, to themselves, and to their environment. So that's the first trend, a technology disruption that changes the workforce. The second transition preceding World War I was the transformation in media. with a slow evolution of a transmission of knowledge from word of mouth to paper printing, newspapers, the so-called gazettes that became more and more democratized. And with them, of course, the more rapid adoption of novel ideas and exposure to new ideas and sentiment against the other. When you learn in school or later on in life that wars are bad, obviously, you have a natural propensity to say, how could we be so stupid to get there? And what we forget is that we get there slowly with small incremental changes, that one job loss at a time to the other, one personal humiliation to the other, create a bubble of pent-up discontent. Add on top of that an event that is going to be emotively charged, and suddenly the chain reaction of national sentiment becomes exponentially powerful. And by the time that spark lights up, it typically lights up on a bedrock of economic imbalances, of personal frustration and sentiment, which can no longer be contained, like we saw in episode 5 with our nuclear chain reaction, by the natural barriers and system slowdown, boron rods, if you will, of the economy and the political discourse. And by then, the politicians, who are machines meant to reflect, maybe sometimes amplify, the collective sentiment of people, their collective frustration, and we have a system which is highly unstable, no longer governed by reason or by a sense of balance, but we have a system that naturally causes governments on both sides of the border to start moving closer to war. And it doesn't take much to then inflame spirits and to create a spark. The same trifecta was really at play that led to World War II. I remember countless times the 1980s, 90s, 70s in my youth, communications and predicates, never that again, where we would be repeating in class or be shown history, documentaries, compelling the future generations to remember. And it is maybe not necessarily the ultimate responsibility of future generations to not repeat the past, but for our generation to know how to stop the inexorable march towards imbalances. And so World War II, in my view, really developed of the second technology revolution brought by faster communication, by a more dematerialization of the economy, and the disconnection, of course, of the financial bubble of Wall Street that led to the Great Depression, the collapse of the financial assets of many of the financial actors, and rippled through the economy to do lasting damage in 1929 that culminated into displacements of economic conditions for many people around the world. And in Germany, of course, just as in any other country. Add to that the evolution of media, which made the media format, which transitioned from the newspaper to the radio. And the radio being a new medium able to transmit the emotion of the speaker, and in particular of Hitler. And emotion has a power, again, that is intrinsically mirrored between a emitter and a receptor. And again, we'll see in the season 2 of the podcast how mirroring plays a role in the construction of a psyche. Fast forward to a few years later, and suddenly that tinderbox explodes again with very weak containment systems, with a Société des Nations which was too weak at the time and could not contain the chain reaction that was about to unleash itself across Europe. So it is, in my view, a reasonable question to ask whether we are these days in a situation like this, witnessing the trifecta of a economic displacement, going from a service industry to a digital knowledge industry, the distanciation and the devaluing of physical world work, service industry, towards data science, artificial intelligence, robotics, all the new darlings of the Silicon Valley, as one big pillar of this trifecta. The second trifecta being the transition of a broadcast medium, television, to a social media format and a novel way of interacting between the actors of the media communication sphere without having enough rods of boron, to use our metaphor from the last episode, to slow down the virality precisely of those emotions and the emotionality of the social media communication. And then a spark which could have come, or maybe is coming, from a skirmish somewhere between two armies of two smaller players, triggering a chain reaction for which we know no outcome. And now, let's go to a short break to hit pause, reflect, or just continue. So we left each other with a fairly heavy question, which is, in effect, are we headed to a war, a World War III, at the time of this extremely unstable moment, with a trifecta of economic imbalances that are disenfranchising hundreds of millions of people, billions of people from their historical way of making money, a disruptive transition between a TV world to a social media world without the existence of safeguards that are helping and slowing down the transmission of toxic messaging. And third, a spark, which could be, in fact, a pandemic, spelling the possibility of social unrest, disruption in food supplies, economic upheaval of unseen proportions. It's a heavy question for today, but one which I truly believe is upon us. And if we want to look at what were the lessons of the past, I can trace and see two avenues of guidance or recovery. The first one is eminently human. We'll have many more times together to explore the human psyche and how and why the human mind absorbs messages, emotions, processes them consciously and subconsciously, looks at them, parks them, avoids to look at them. But I truly believe that we have had very little time, if not to say no time, to think about, learn how we adapt to those new communication medium. In 10, 20 years, I believe, actually, that we as society will have learned how to take with a grain of salt what we see on social media, what we read on Twitter, or whatever will be Twitter at the time. We will discount what we read and see on large social media sites. We will have found ways, maybe programmatically with technology, maybe through a mix of technology and regulation, we will have found the ways and built the ways to slow down the chain reactions of virality and to make a societal decision led by modern politicians to decide how to regulate the control rods, the rods of boron, to use our nuclear power plant analogy, how to control the messaging and find the right balance between freedom of speech and virality and control thereof. Those are the new questions that the political leaders of the future will have to tackle. And every one of us as human beings will have a role to play, either as emitter of messages or as receptors or as retransmitters of messages, always striving to add value instead of just blindly rerouting messages. So the human part is what gives me hope, because if you look at history, despite the devastation of the past world wars, our grandparents, our parents learned lessons and learned how to be humble, learned how to look at the positive, even after having lived through the horror of war and its consequences. Humanity has a capacity for adaptation and survival, which ultimately dictates at scale for the rest of society a corrective behavior. It may take a few years, it may take a decade or two, But I believe, like Martin Luther King, that the arc of history bends in the right direction, but ever so slightly. The second way that we would have to and will have a chance to think and rethink the new world order, which is to rise out of this pandemic, is to learn how to establish the boundaries that are necessary for containing the chain reactions and the technology adoptions. I am not saying that technology is bad per se, but I am saying that because we now live in a world of exponential virality, the impact that new technologies can have on the economy is accelerating at such a pace that the speed at which the traditional ways that society has to adjust for the work imbalances, for the job market imbalances, those ways have to be rethought. It would take, at the beginning of the 20th century, 2 generations of a family to go from the grandfather who was working the land to the father working at the factory to the son getting a degree at school and become a service industry clerk. Today, the speed at which the retooling of the workforce is having to occur is arguably a challenge. How do you turn a farmer in Iowa into a data scientist? Can it be done? Should it be done? Should it be considered? That is an eminently political question which has been haphazardly answered over the past decade, with some leaders clearly articulating that question and others sensing the emotional power of that question and exploiting it to their advantage without really coming up with a plan. And so I think that it is not all lost, but that the changes afoot in front of us have the potential of tearing apart the social fabric of the economy and the peace as we know it, but also have and bear the fruit for a societal discourse which will take the necessity of a million voices and a million little conversations to bear fruit. It is a challenge of a lifetime. It is a challenge of decades ahead of work at rebuilding a system that integrates this new medium, this transition into the medium that we are observing. The economy, the democracy, the 3 branches of power, legislative, judicial, and executive, are all living within the container of the media format that we use to communicate. And so it behooves us all to be thinking about what personal role we can take in doing that evolution, in leading and changing that evolution. Because at a time when the tinderbox is there, the powder is dry, we are facing most likely the greatest challenge of many generations past and many generations to come. And so humbly, this little podcast is maybe my way of participating into this long river of voices. I look forward to be hearing from you through your commentary, emails, responses, and your questions as well. This podcast is a simple way of sharing my thoughts. It is a personal endeavor, nothing more. A way to connect. The views and opinions represented in this podcast are solely mine. They are in no way, nor should they be assumed to be shared, supported, endorsed by my employer, the sponsors of this show, Anchor.fm, where it is hosted, and all the distributors thereof. You may find more information, links, pictures, videos, documents, and more, which may have been referenced in this podcast on my website at www.uteza.com/podcast. There, it feels so much better after saying all of this. And so, it's time to part ways, at least for now. Until next time, time to say goodnight, time to hit pause.